Okay, let's get started. So, welcome everyone today to our first in-person Energy Symposium of 2024 here at the University of Texas at Austin. I'm Kerry King, research scientist and assistant director at the Energy Institute here at the University of Texas at Austin. It sponsors this. You can put our more formal sponsor here as our speaker for today. But before I introduce our Energy Institute director, our speaker today, we will look at what's upcoming the next 2 weeks. So next week, we'll kind of have a book talk. Jamie Van Nostrand has written a book called The Coal Trap, How West Virginia Was Left Behind in the Clean Energy Revolution. So he's sort of on leave right now from West Virginia University. So we can hear his interpretation of the politics or the history of West Virginia and coal. After that, we'll have Kyrie Baker, who's assistant professor at the University of Colorado Boulder. She works on smart grid, integrating renewables, all things electric grid, and going more renewable. So we'll hear what she is talking about here with the software upgrade for the grid. But today, I will introduce our speaker today, Dr. Brian Korgel, who is our director of the UT Energy Institute now for 2 years, and also the Rashid Engineering Regents Chair. Professor of Chemical Engineering. He'll give a talk for about 30 minutes or so. And then our Energy Journalism Fellow here at the UT Energy Institute, Andy Uhler, will kind of do a little back and forth Q&A and have your own questions ready as well. So a little background on Brian. As I said, he's the director of the Energy Institute here, and he's also Regents Chair of Professor in Chemical Engineering. He directs what's known as an Industry University Cooperative Research Center. It's called For a Solar Powered Future, SPF 2050. So he's a materials specialist, nano materials specialist, and working in the solar area as well as others. He's also associate editor of the journal Chemistry and Materials. He's done 260 invited talks. Surely he'll be on time today. He's in 280 papers, so he's one of the most prolific academics we have here on campus, member of the National Academy of Engineering, and he's founded 2 companies, Life and Pinion Technologies. Also a fellow of the American Advancement of the Association of Science. So Association for the Advancement of Science. So no stranger to academics. Andy Uhler, who will be talking with him afterwards, is award-winning public radio correspondent. Many of you may have heard him on our local national public radio station, KUT. You may have also heard him on Marketplace as part of American Public Media, and now he's serving as an Energy Journalism Fellow, where he gets to take a little bit of leave from that and focus and really learn about energy instead of just reporting in 30-second sound bites. Okay? But he's a UT alum as well from the LBJ School of Public Affairs. He helped launch Texas Standard, if anybody's heard that, on KUT, so it's a welcome to have him here. So with that said, I'm going to now hand it over to Brian, who's going to go over to his presentation, which is going to talk about the University of Texas' role and larger vision of the HyVelocity Hydrogen Hub, which is one of the very large funded programs by the Department of Energy to promote hydrogen infrastructure across the United States, and in this case, the Gulf Coast or South Texas. So I will convert to presentation. There we go. All right, thanks so much. Great. Okay,
yeah, no, it's a pleasure to be here. So this is kind of supposed to be semi-fun. Not that science and engineering is not always fun all the time, 100% all the time. But so we, in the Energy Institute, we have the pleasure of having Andy Uhler as our Energy Journalism Fellow. So Andy, if you've listened to Marketplace on NPR, you probably, and there's an energy story, you probably heard Andy say something really insightful about hydrogen or whatever. And so with the HyVelocity Hub, UT Austin is part of the HyVelocity Hub. It's one of 7 regional clean hydrogen hubs selected by the Department of Energy for funding. And it's kind of a big deal. So I actually went to Philadelphia and heard Biden announce the hubs, and that was pretty cool. And I have these other journalists ask me, what's the hub all about? What's going on? And so I thought, okay, well, let's do an energy symposium about this and have Andy ask me a few questions. So I have a bunch of slides that I'm going to squeeze into like 30 minutes. And this is recorded. I'm also happy to share slides with people afterwards if you want to see them. But I'm giving you a little bit of warning. I'm going to go through the slides pretty fast. All right. So what I'm going to talk about is the HyVelocity Hydrogen Hub, a little bit about the process of that. So, there are things you can read about the HyVelocity Hub. We did a Department of Energy thing explaining the hub. You can watch that stuff. What you probably won't have is any insight about how did UT get involved in the hub? What are we doing in hydrogen? So I want to talk a little bit about that, and then a little bit about the U.S. model for energy innovation. All right, so it's really interesting. The speaker after this is going to talk about West Virginia and coal. At Energy Week last week, I did a little between two cacti with Brian Korgel. That's me with Luke Bassett. So Luke Bassett was, I think he was chief of staff under Senator Manchin, and basically helped write the infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act. And talking to him about where did that all come about is the Inflation Reduction Act, infrastructure bill. It's all about giving incentives to communities to create jobs in the emerging energy economy. So, okay, maybe West Virginia, coal industry has changed, but thinking about the future, how will states like West Virginia take advantage of the Inflation Reduction Act, hydrogen hubs, all of that. So that should be, y'all should ask him, whoever the speaker is, some questions about that. All right, so a little bit about the Energy Institute. The Energy Institute was founded in 2009, essentially to be the convener of energy expertise across campus. We have about 360 faculty and staff researchers. UT is an amazing place. We have like the Bureau of Economic Geology, Korgel School of Engineering. Within engineering, we have the Department of Chemical Engineering, we have the Petroleum Engineering Department. We have the Center for Electromechanics, we have the Macomb School of Business, we've got K. Bailey Hutchison Center for Energy Policy, Business Law, and now Engineering. The first thing I tried to do when I became director of the Energy Institute was figure out how many energy centers there were at UT, because nobody knew. And I got up to about 28, okay, of various industry affiliates programs, centers, and that's not counting the department. So this is like 360 researchers, and then all the PhD students who are doing research under them. And so the Energy Institute really was created to try to bring all of this together. And so when I stepped in the role, the first thing I was asking our leadership at UT is what should I do as director of the Energy Institute? Like, what does the Energy Institute do? And basically it's like, oh, come up with, big plans. And so I asked our strategic industry partners a little bit about, well, what do you think are the challenges? How can UT help? So I got some ideas, and one of the ideas that seems to really be growing, that was seeded in early conversations. The first conversation I had was with one of our partners, Hai-Bin Chu, who's on our industry advisory board from Shell, and he started talking to me about industrial decarbonization. And so if you think about emissions in the energy sector, where do they come from? About 30% of the emissions come from industrial processes. A lot of those processes are called hard to abate processes. They're difficult to decarbonize. It's like steel making, cement, chemicals, things like that. And that's kind of where hydrogen fits in. Okay, a lot of people will ask, what do you use hydrogen for? So you can use hydrogen for transportation, low emissions transportation fuels, but its main thing now is really trying to reduce emissions from the industrial sector. So industrial decarbonization. All right, so the first Energy Week that I helped organize with Carrie and Dave Tuttle and the team, we had a series of panels. It was all virtual at that time. And so we pulled together a panel, for example, on industrial decarbonization. We had Marwa Al-Ansari from Shell and Todd Brady from Intel, and then me kind of talking to them about industrial decarbonization. What are the plans? What are the goals? And if you think about industrial decarbonization, there are two key pillars to that. One is process electrification, and the other one is hydrogen, so clean hydrogen. So right now, when you make hydrogen, what's called gray hydrogen, you take natural gas, you water gas shift reaction, or in a SMR reactor, and you form hydrogen. In the process, you create a lot of CO2. So, 10, 11, 12 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of hydrogen. So there are a lot of emissions related to hydrogen. So in order for hydrogen to reduce emissions, you've got to come up with new ways of making hydrogen. So clean hydrogen processes. Blue hydrogen, where you're making the hydrogen from natural gas, but you're capturing the CO2 and you're storing it. Or you're doing electrolysis, where you're using renewable electricity to split water into hydrogen. So hydrogen is one part, and then process electrification, where you have some chemical processes, you're doing heating, and instead of burning natural gas to get the temperatures up, you have electrical processes. So at UT, we've been kind of diving into this aspect of industrial decarbonization. And so this is an old slide that I presented to the advisory board at the Energy Institute shortly after I'd started thinking about what can we do at UT in terms of industrial decarbonization. So I just want to put a plug into the electrification really quickly. UT has a really unique and valuable asset. It's a pilot scale chemical plant at a Pickle Research Campus. It's called the James Fair Process Science and Technology Center. And so that is now the centerpiece of a new center that was funded. So thanks to Michael Baldane, Chemical Engineering, and Bruce Eldridge, with some help from Roger Wanacase, and I was weighing in and having meetings and stuff like that. And so we're part of a $70 million DOE center, and with matching, it comes up to about $140 million to look at electrified processes for industry without carbon. Arizona State was the lead. UT, though, is a key partner, and this center looks at electrification of heating processes in a variety of different hard-to-abate sectors. So food and beverage, chemical, paper, looking at steel. And UT's role, Michael Baldea is the CTO of the whole center and is focused on the chemical industry. So we got that funded. So we have kind of that part that's going. And then in terms of hydrogen, UT has this amazing amount of expertise in hydrogen. We have probably 80 faculty and staff researchers doing research in hydrogen. Not only do we have the individuals doing what they do, we have centers. So 2 centers that are doing amazing work. There's the Hydrogen at Scale project, which is out of the Center for Electromechanics, Michael Lewis and his folks there, Bob Hebner, Alan Lloyd helping with that. And then out of Bureau of Economic Geology, we have a geological hydrogen storage industry affiliates program. So when I came in, there are all these assets on hydrogen, and the infrastructure bill, infrastructure law now, was announced in November. I started like September 1, and then November of that year, the infrastructure law came out, and there were these hydrogen hubs, regional clean hydrogen hubs, $8 billion set aside. There was a lot of interest at UT in the CHIPS Act. So semiconductors, it was like, oh, big money's coming with semiconductors. The big money, like the energy and the funding for energy research dwarfs semiconductors. It's pretty remarkable. And so this idea that there will be a hub, for example, that will get $2 billion of funding is crazy. It's really historically unprecedented. So we had these assets at UT, and the idea is, okay, well, how can we make use of those assets and be able to compete for one of the hubs? And so in the hub program, at least 4 hubs had to be funded. So there was $8 billion set aside, at least 4 hubs, so it could be up to $2 billion. Those hubs had to have a geographic diversity, but also a diversity in feedstock. And so at least 1 hub would produce hydrogen, clean hydrogen from fossil fuels, at least 1 from renewable energy. So if you look at Texas, we have a lot of oil and gas. Okay, so great place to do that. We also have a lot of solar and wind. Okay, so Texas, we have a high potential for a hydrogen hub, both on the renewable side and the oil and gas side. And so if you look at the cost of hydrogen, kind of calculated based on renewables from Texas, it's pretty low relative to other states, other countries. And for hydrogen from natural gas, it's even lower. Okay, so we're having discussions about this hub program. Texas should have one. How does UT play a role? And so those were a lot of the discussions. All right, so when you think about hydrogen, you have production, storage, distribution, end use. We do research on all of that. And if you think about the potential outcome of an emerging hydrogen economy for Texas, it's huge. Texas already has the biggest hydrogen economy in the United States, so it produces and uses more hydrogen than any other state, but it's this gray hydrogen, okay? So people, I mean, these are all like speculative numbers, but people are throwing around numbers like, oh, the future hydrogen economy is $100 billion, 180,000 new jobs. So how do we play a role in that? And so this was something I was talking to the advisory board for the Energy Institute. What is the role for Texas? What is the role for UT? How do we create a competitive hub? And so with help, collaboration from a lot of folks at UT and around the region, we ended up connecting with Brett Perlman from Center for Houston's Future and Brian Weeks from GTI Energy. And those guys, especially Brian Weeks, loves UT. Brian is embedded in the Hydrogen Scale Project, thinks very, very highly of UT and what UT's been doing in terms of hydrogen. And so welcomed us on that team. And it's really is a team, it's an industry-led hub in California. The situation was a little bit different where the state of California said, we're gonna do a hub and put in resources. Texas did not do any of that. Texas was like, we don't know if we like hydrogen or not. Basically what the story was in Texas. And so the companies came together and with some leadership and rallied around this HyVelocity Hub proposal. So I managed, this was the first quote I got from Jay Hartzell for anything that the Energy Institute was doing. So I was like, yes, okay, the president likes it enough to give us a quote. And so we were selected, and it was a long process of concept paint. You go, first you have to identify a team. We were waiting for a long time for the FOA, which is the announcement to come out. It wasn't, so basically the announcement comes out, defines what's going to be in the hub. So a few things that were pretty clear. These were commercial demonstration projects, specifically said research is not allowed. So for a place like UT, what do we do if no research is allowed in the hub? So what is our role in all of that? And so there was a lot of planning, then the concept paper, the proposal, then the selection, and now we're going through negotiations, which hopefully will be done April or May. So our hub was selected to up to $1.2 billion of funding from the Department of Energy. That has to be matched 1-to-1 by industry sponsors. So it's really up to a $2.4 billion 10-year effort. There were 7 hubs selected, so they're spread around. So ours is called the Gulf Coast Hydrogen Hub. It's really 7 companies, 9 projects, which I'll talk about, but these are the companies: AES, Air Liquide, Chevron, ExxonMobil, Sempra, Ørsted, Mitsubishi Power, and then UT Austin leading as the academic, the founding partner with GTI Energy, and then Center for Houston's Future and Houston Advanced Research Consortium. So HyVelocity is its thing. It's basically the 7 companies with these supporting organizations. And the role of UT Austin is sort of twofold. We're in charge of life cycle analysis and techno-economic analysis of all the projects that report back to DOE, and also very heavily involved in the community benefits planning. So a big part of this infrastructure bill was something called community benefits plans. So the idea was that There's an initiative called Justice 40 Initiative. So 40% of the benefits from these DOE funded projects need to flow to the communities, and especially disadvantaged communities where these projects are. So the idea is you have a community benefits plan, so you can realize those 40% of the benefits. And what does that mean? It's DOE's wrapping its head around it. It's jobs, it's reduced emissions, quality of life sorts of things. And so it's a huge effort. And there are the companies, there's us with GIPI Energy and Center for Houston Future, advisors like the National Labs, Fort Houston, other academic institutions, community workforce economic development organizations, off-takers for the hydrogen, and about 100 companies supporting the hub. So it's a huge effort. About 40% of the projects are green hydrogens. They're electrolysis. 60% of projects are blue. If you add that up by the amount of hydrogen produced, about 80% of the hydrogen is coming from blue. So from natural gas, 20% from electrolysis. Okay, so this is the hub. The hub is really focused. It's Gulf Coast. It's kind of down to the project down to Corpus Christi. There's some project activity in Southwest Louisiana, up to Dallas, Texas Triangle. A little bit of connection with West Texas. The idea of a hydrogen hub is really to focus on how do you bring together all the components, making the hydrogen, also the end users. So this is the hub. There are 9 projects. I'm just going to read through them really quickly. It's probably as difficult to see, but we've broken up the projects into 4 regional zones. Okay, so the Corpus Christi demand cluster, Houston demand cluster, this Beaumont Port Arthur Lake Charles demand cluster, and the Texas Triangle cluster. Okay. All right. So there's a Chevron Air Liquide project that's focused on making low carbon intensity hydrogen and then turning that into ammonia. There's the Port Arthur Energy Hub, which is basically a separate infrastructure project that makes use of their pipelines and some of their LNG infrastructure, turning that over to hydrogen, hydrogen storage. There's an ExxonMobil hydrogen pipeline in the Houston area. AES has a green hydrogen project that's around the ship channel. There's an Ørsted e-methanol project, which is a power to X facility. So to produce green hydrogen from offshore wind and solar farms to create e-methanol, they call it. And Mitsubishi Power Americas project in South Texas. So making green hydrogen by electrolysis and then large scale hydrogen storage. And then there's a Air Liquide project that's 30 tons per day of hydrogen liquefier along the Gulf Coast tied to a hydrogen pipeline. And then ExxonMobil hydrogen mobility project. Okay, so these are the projects. Again, a mixture of blue hydrogen, green hydrogen, carbon capture and storage is a key component. There's a transportation component, looking at offtake in terms of ammonia, e-methanol. Those are some of the key components in the hub. All right, so these are some of the assets of our region. So a lot of those. And then community engagement is a big part of this. So job creation. So my personal role in the hub is actually being in charge of workforce development for the entire hub. So thinking about job creation and all of that. I think I'm just going to let Andy ask me some questions. I'm going to just wanted to say 2 things real quick. One is the potential impact of this hub. So we have another project within the Energy Institute called the Permian Energy Development Lab, focused on West Texas. So how will the hub help generate a hydrogen economy in West Texas in the Permian Basin? And then in terms of international competitiveness, what will this do? And this hydrogen work is critical to decarbonization. So the Biden administration has a goal of 2035 for a net zero electrical grid. Okay, so that's one key goal. It's coming up really quickly. And then net zero carbon emissions overall by 2050. So hydrogen is a key part of that. And so how does the US compete with the rest of the world? So not only Texas, but the United States. And so different countries, different regions have different types of policies. The European Union for a while was using more of a stick kind of approach. So if you go over a certain amount of emissions, you get penalized. The United States has really taken more of a carrot approach, at least in terms of hydrogen. So incentivizing people to make clean hydrogen. And so there's the infrastructure bill, and then there's the Inflation Reduction Act. So a lot of discussion now about this 45B tax credit. And if you have thoughts on that, the comment period is still open. They released the draft right before Christmas, and there's a 60-day period. Anyone can comment if you don't like any of the provisions for the production tax credit for hydrogen. You can maybe influence that. All right, so that's what I want to give you a little bit of background, and now Andy can ask me a few questions, and then we'll open it up to questions more generally.
Thanks, Brian. No, it's funny because I just got an email about a reading group for pages 6 through 15 of the 45V DOE announcement from a different university. So I think a lot of people are very excited about sort of weighing in, but also understand. I think all of that stuff is so fascinating because you get in the weeds so fast that people who have a good understanding of exactly what's happening in those, especially in those funding bills, you will have a job wherever you want, basically, I think. Brian, thanks for doing this. This is great. I have so many questions about the HyVelocity Hub. My first one, first of all, HyVelocity is its own business, right? Break down sort of how that worked, because it was a coalition of industry and then NGOs, but also UT. Break down sort of how that works.
Yeah, so in the end, so the different hubs have different models for how their governance structure and all that. For the hub here, HyVelocity, it's really an industry-led hub. 7 companies are going to own HyVelocity as an entity. GTI Energy kind of coordinated the whole proposal, but then because the grant is so big, GTI Energy is a nonprofit. If they would have submitted it and gotten the grant, they would have lost their nonprofit status. So that was an issue for them. So they created this shell, this HyVelocity shell. It's actually HyVelocity that submitted the application, and now part of what we're talking about is the governance structure and things like that for the hub. But yeah, the companies are putting in a lot of money, and so they are kind of viewing HyVelocity as a business. From a UT perspective, educational perspective, this has so much potential to be transformative for communities, job creation, workforce development programs. So we have a slightly different view of it, you know, as opposed to just a business. It's actually a potential for a lot of positive good in the region. So how do we
Is there a scenario in which students go and work sort of at this? We had talked about sort of, it's kind of an amorphous, the idea of a hydrogen hub. It's not necessarily going to be, you know, one place, but the idea of internships and things like that, I imagine.
There'll be tons of internships. I mean, some of those will definitely be administered through HyVelocity, but then each company, these are, again, commercial demonstration projects, so things are being built, and there will be internships, I mean, apprenticeships, all kinds of things. I think especially like for undergrad chemical engineers at UT, there'll probably be some amazing co-op opportunities or internship programs where you actually get to be on site where they're building the facility.
You had talked about, and I love this idea of, for somebody like me who hears 80% of this is going to be initially going to be natural gas fuel.
Mhm.
But then what kept coming up was the idea of clean hydrogen in this hub. So break down for me, that's gonna be carbon capture and storage, it's gonna be, break down for me how clean.
Well,
this is
so
gonna be.
all of the hydrogen has to be clean. It has to meet a low carbon standard, which for the proposal was set at 2 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram hydrogen, which is much lower than the 11 or 12 currently. So the hydrogen made from natural gas still has to have a very low CO2 intensity. And so the way that that happens is you convert the natural gas into hydrogen and then you give off CO2 as a byproduct. You have to capture that and then put it in the ground. That has to happen from the beginning. And then the green hydrogen. So there's actually discussion now about what's going to be the cleaner hydrogen. Because if it's green hydrogen, you're just taking electricity off the grid. The grid is not particularly clean right now. So that's not even going to qualify as green hydrogen. You're going to have to perhaps build new wind farms, build new solar, make sure that the electricity you're getting is actually coming from the renewable resources and not from the grid. So just because it's green doesn't mean it's actually low carbon intensity. It's like, where are you getting those electrons? When are you getting them? And that's tricky. And then on the blue hydrogen part, it's also a bit tricky just technologically, how well and cost effectively can you do the CO2 capture and the storage.
Because I went out to Air Liquide, who they have a big site in outside of Baytown, outside of the sort of refinery Riviera there outside of Houston. And they had talked to me about, they sort of lucked out, and when they first established this site, they essentially leased twice of the amount of space that they needed, us hoping, and I guess assuming that they were going to expand. The big expansion that they're doing is actually carbon capture and storage for an existing hydrogen plant. And so I imagine that's sort of working all of these things into, like you said, the technology that's going to have to exist, the sort of partnerships that are going to have to exist. This all sort of speaks to the idea of a hub, right?
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. So there's actually right now a big carbon capture and storage conference going on. There was a talk this morning from ExxonMobil about their Baytown facility. That part of that is kind of part of the hub, but the actual retro sort of activity that they're doing is a bit different. And it's fascinating because you know, when electric vehicles came online, I remember talking to one of my colleagues about, well, if you're getting electricity from a coal-fired power plant somewhere, you still have all these emissions. What good is that doing? And so in the long term, you end up, okay, you get rid of the coal, you put more solar and all that online. Maybe you can control the point of the emissions and do carbon capture where you can't do that on a bunch of cars. So that's kind of the strategy that like ExxonMobil is looking at for their Baytown facility, where they have a chemical process with 100 stacks and they have CO2 coming out. You can't do point source carbon capture on all these 100 stacks because it's too expensive to do that. So what they're doing is basically creating a clean hydrogen facility, and they're going to use that hydrogen to do the heating on the facility, so you don't have to do carbon capture. So they're like moving the emissions in that way. You know, the other big off taker is like this e-methanol and the ammonia. So either reducing the carbon footprint of fertilizer, which uses the ammonia, or you can use ammonia as a fuel maybe, or the methanol as a fuel. So you're reducing carbon intensity of a fuel that is not using the actual hydrogen to propel the plane or whatever, but you're lowering the carbon intensity of the fuel in that way.
One of the big questions I had for when I was out at Air Liquide and talking to ExxonMobil, talking to all these big companies was, is this a field of dream situation where, do we know where the demand is? Is it if you build it, they will come? Do we, because industry's having to put up, like you said, one to one, what the feds are putting up, they have to, I imagine, believe that there is going to be demand, or do they sort of calculate this into the books?
They believe there's demand. You know, there's uncertainty. Everyone's been waiting for these tax guidelines to come out, the Inflation Reduction Act. So there's a bit of leap of faith at the moment. But all of these energy companies, oil and gas companies, have low carbon businesses right now, and they're putting a big bet on those, and so if they believe that those businesses are going to make money, they have to believe there are customers and that there's going to be demand. And so these hydrogen hubs, one requirement for the hub proposal is that the demand in the region needed to meet the production in the region. So you couldn't just say, I'm going to make all this hydrogen and export it. So the hub program is doing a couple of things that's incentivizing, but one is definitely market creation for clean hydrogen.
You had talked a little bit about this, and I know you're focused specifically on the benefits of the Justice 40 package and the idea, because right now you said we're sort of working through what the legislation says. It's pretty muddy when you say, you know, sort of capital B benefits. What does that really mean? Is there skepticism about, you know, sort of how this plays out? Are community activists sort of looking at this saying, well, what are you actually going to do for us? Is it infrastructure? Is it cleaner water? Is it cleaner air?
Yeah, there's a lot of discussion. I mean, there's a lot of distrust, you know,
Sure.
in the environmental justice, energy justice community.
Because they've been burned.
Yeah, you know, if you look near, you know, a chemical plant or facility, a lot of times you'll sort of see a mixture of communities. Some communities that have really benefited from the economic flow and all of that in their community, and other communities that have not for whatever reason. And so the idea is to create a structure so that everybody benefits. It's not selective, like, well, okay, your community is going to benefit, your community is not, you know, that sort of thing. There's a lot of distrust. There's a lot of trust building that's happening. Again, Department of Energy, I think, is trying to figure out how to measure these benefits. You know, if you're looking at meeting the Justice 40 initiative, what are those benefits? They're really not defined right now. And so there has to be ideally collaboration between the communities, community leaders, and industry, and that's where universities come in. I mean, we need to be sort of facilitators for those discussions. We need to be at the table. That's why it doesn't make sense to just have this be 7 companies or 100 companies without universities. That's an important role.
So one of the things, every time I pitch a hydrogen story to any of my editors, to any of the sort of shows that I pitch to, the one thing that comes up is this a boondoggle? Is this sort of the idea of all this money from the government being made available? All these companies are going to get in on that. Are they actually going to be producing? Are they actually going to be sort of making this clean hydrogen? Your perspective is different because you've been in these meetings. Tell me about, what would you say to my editors if they're asking me about a boondoggle?
Yeah, I mean, it's not, but I mean, I saw President Biden talk about why the infrastructure bill, why these hydrogen hubs were important to him and his administration. And it's about jobs, like job creation. So, so is it a boondoggle? I mean, it's a way for a government to inject money into the economy to create jobs. And it's really about job creation, job growth. It's also about incentivizing the creation of markets. Will that end up over the long term holding? You know, I think it will. I don't think the world is going to go back. I think we'll continue to reduce carbon emissions. I think we have to. The companies are pushing that way. So I don't think it's a boondoggle. There's enough you can use hydrogen for that it makes sense to make more and reduce emissions. So in that sense, but will there be $100 billion market coming, or will there be 180,000 new jobs? I think that, how many new jobs will there be? But I don't think it's a boondoggle. And I think if you're serious about getting to a net zero and greenhouse gas emissions, you have to have a source of clean hydrogen. So this is one best attempt of getting there.
Well, that's the other sort of question that I get too, is for the idea of a lifeline for fossil fuel companies, right?
Yeah.
That we're going to be producing so much hydrogen through natural gas that you're essentially, that's the argument, is that you're essentially giving these natural gas companies a market, right? That they didn't necessarily have. is this going, are we going to have to think about this when we talk about sort of capital C clean and carbon capture? Sort of how does that, how do we get rid of that idea of this is just a lifeline for fossil fuels? Or maybe it is.
Yeah, no, I don't think it's at all a lifeline for fossil fuels. I think the thing is if you look at economic productivity of a nation, it correlates with the amount of energy you use. You know, that's kind of leveled out a little bit in the United States. So once you get to a certain point, maybe your energy use doesn't have to keep going up exponentially. But for developing economies and that sort of thing, they are going to continue to use more and more energy, and there are emissions associated with that. Like there's no magic, there are no emissions when you use energy. So hydrogen is an important part of that. You know, when we talk about process electrification, solar, wind, all of that, lowering the emissions on the power grid, but that requires new technologies. How do you do long-term energy storage? Hydrogen can play a big role in that. So I think the system, the energy system is very complicated. Everything kind of, there's an interplay of the electrical grid plus, you know, the gasoline you put in your car. The materials, there's a big effort looking at embodied carbon in buildings, so different materials. You really need clean hydrogen to solve, in some capacity, to solve all the challenges with these. So I think, honestly, I think people who might say it's a boondoggle just don't quite understand like what the role of hydrogen is.
I'm curious from your perspective as somebody who's sitting in on these meetings, because it's outside of your scope as somebody who teaches chemical engineering, somebody who's the director of the Energy Institute. Insights from you about the way that industry talks about the hydrogen, the way the industry sort of talks about the energy industry more generally. Have you grown, do you think, just as a result of having been a part of this process?
Me personally?
Yeah. Yeah, like you know, more knowledge or you know, obviously about you own a couple of, you started a couple of businesses. Is it these are the ways that I need to be thinking about stuff?
Yeah, I mean, so as I get further along in my career, I mean, when I was an assistant professor, to get tenure, there's kind of a formula of things you need to do. You need to raise funds for your research group, you need to publish papers, give some talks. And that's great. And then you do those things and you have a certain impact on your scientific community. But I think as I get older and more mature, and I've done some of that, and I still like to have impact in that way. Yeah, you sort of think, okay, I have a fairly prominent position at the University Energy Institute, talk to a wide variety of stakeholders and communities, industry. How can I personally try to influence everyone to make the world better? And that is really challenging.
Sure.
And sometimes frustrating, but other times really helpful. I mean, it's been pretty cool to do that. But yeah, I don't know that I necessarily have personally have had training to do what I'm doing now. So it's a lot of learning on the job, which is kind of fun. But anyway, for students out there, I would say you have so much potential to do positive good for your communities and in your jobs that you may not fully appreciate. So keep that in mind as you're going into the future.
That's the other thing I was going to ask you about too. Sort of the idea of internships. We talked about that, and the ability to maybe go to Southeast Texas, learn on the job, things like that. But also, you and I were talking about the idea of a curriculum. The idea of we don't necessarily have a hydrogen sort of program here at the university, but now that things like $1.2 billion from the Department of Energy, then you start thinking about it. Then you start thinking about the workforce in sort of a let's design a curriculum way, right?
Yeah, well, for the university, this has been a debate for a long time, and will continue to be. Is like, how specialized do you want your education to be, or do you think it should be? Like, do you know, one extreme is it's not specialized at all. Like you're learning like how to read Greek and Latin and all of that, studying the scholars and all that. The other extreme is you really dive into this is hydrogen. I mean, my research area is nanomaterials, nanotechnology. You know, there was a lot of discussion about should we have a nanotechnology degree?
Sure.
And some schools adopted that. I would say the majority decided not to and to keep kind of broader. This is your physics degree and chemical engineering. I tend to sort of think that's a better approach to, so you have like an elective on hydrogen, maybe you don't have a hydrogen degree. But I think that each discipline has its strengths and weaknesses. In chemical engineering, I think we learn how to think of systems of like the unit operations and things. And that can apply to anything. It can apply to hydrogen, can apply to carbon capture and storage, the entire energy sector. But you can't learn everything. So I definitely think we're gonna see, there'll probably at least be a few hydrogen elective classes. I know executive education.
Yeah.
There are training programs in hydrogen, training programs in carbon capture and storage. I think the thing that's sort of missing is the connection. If you talk about blue hydrogen, you're not just talking about hydrogen, you're talking about point source carbon capture, CO2 storage, you're talking about policy, like how do you get class 6 permitting of a well for that, like, so that tie-in for all of that, I actually think that's the more important thing than just learning like the basics of how a fuel cell works.
This sort of incorporating the Bureau of Economic Geology folks and the collaboration between two. I was gonna ask you about the collaboration between and how much the different hubs, there are 7 hydrogen hubs that were awarded. Again, there are going to be differences between sort of the regionality. Stuff that's happening in Southeast Texas isn't necessarily happening in Pennsylvania. At the same time, are those institutions, are those different, I know different companies are invested in different places simultaneously, but I'm curious about the collaboration between institutions that are sort of heading up the hub.
Yeah, so far it's been very competitive.
Sure.
Because I mean, hubs are competing against each other, but once the awards go out, DOE wants the hubs to collaborate. So there will definitely be knowledge sharing, collaboration between workforce development programs, community benefits, best practices, what's working, what's not. And that will happen. But right now it's still, people are still, I mean, it hasn't been awarded, you know, we've been selected. There are at least 3 backup hubs on call in case someone screws up their negotiation. So I wouldn't say it's been awarded yet, selected, but yeah, there'll be a lot of collaboration and knowledge sharing.
Gary, I wanted to open up, we have 10 minutes or so. Yeah, questions. Go ahead.
You wanna pick it? I got a couple
Yeah,
on
you
mine,
go.
or you-
Yeah, no.
So how much of the investment in this regional hydrogen ecosystem contingent on the 45B tax credit?
Oh.
The implementation details.
I will point out there's 2 questions online about, do you have any insight about the rules that came out
45B,
about
yeah.
45B? Yep, 45B, you both mentioned it, so
Sure.
anything you want to add on that, people are asking.
Well, real quick, so 45B is a long document from the 60 pages or something. Document from the Treasury about the guidelines of how much tax, so there are different emissions buckets, so the less carbon you're emitting, the more tax rate you get and that sort of thing. The 45B, so if you do blue hydrogen, you can get a tax credit of 45B, or you can get 45Q, which is for the carbon capture and storage, which is also significant. Those tax incentives are pretty significant, like they're real. And for a lot of projects, both blue and green, they probably would not be economically viable without 45B and 45Q right now. They're significant, they're real.
Can you stack, I don't know this, can you stack 45B and 45Q if you're upstream, you know, if you're capturing, I guess you could.
No, I think 45B for carbon, if you have a blue hydrogen project, you have to do it, I think.
Gotcha.
But I think you can stack the solar production tax credit plus 45B, I think those are stackable. And then there's a big thing in the new tax laws, which is transferability.
Yeah.
So you can actually sell like tax equity and stuff, which is opening up a whole another market for things. But no, those tax incentives are very real. I would say the funding for the hubs looks like a lot of money, like this $8 billion. But for example, AES has a big green hydrogen project. It's not in the hub, but up in North Texas, that's been public, and that's a $4 billion project just for one thing. And so these 7 companies are splitting $1.2 billion of DOE money. Sounds like a lot, but it's actually not a huge amount. So I think the infrastructure bill money is actually getting people to talk in a way that they get excited, they're talking to each other in a way they're not already, but the tax benefits and Inflation Reduction Act are real to help make everything economic and give people peace of mind that they can build these facilities and not go completely bankrupt on them.
Well, I'll just ask one here, and we can go to the other first. Maybe 2 quick ones. Is there anything about, well, I think you mentioned hydrogen, there's 3 backups. There's a question about, what about the DOE hubs that did not get funded? Is there any role for them? Then the second one is there small modular reactors involved in the hubs, or maybe nuclear in general?
Yeah, there's
Whatever
one,
you know.
there's at least one nuclear hub.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's up, I forget, Illinois or Indiana or something. So there's one, at least one, or I think unless it's Pennsylvania, but anyway, it's there. And then, for the hubs that weren't selected, again, like just putting the proposal together was getting people to talk, both on the production side, demand side, talk with the ports, for example. And I think that there will be benefits to that in the long term. Also, like in terms of Justice 40 initiatives, I think everyone's learning, and I'm sure people who, if they have really good ideas, maybe weren't funded, can be adopted in some way by some hub. I'm sure that one.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, Andy, I wanted to make a comment about the energy, carbon capture, hydrogen energy curriculum we're talking about.
Yeah.
So I'm an undergraduate finance major. Last semester, I got a chance to take a carbon capture storage class and an LCA class in the PGE school.
Okay.
So it'd be nice if there were more awareness on, even Macomb students or Coca-Cola students can sort of get into these classes.
Yeah.
And something I learned, Brian, from my PGE professors is green hydrogen usually comes at a premium to the market. So how is this affecting the demand of, the 17 off-takers you guys have identified and incremental off-takers that you guys will gain? So.
Yeah, you're saying right now green hydrogen's more expensive than blue is basically.
Right.
Yeah, I think that is true. That shows in the amount of production within our hub. That's why 80% of the production HyVelocity is blue versus the green. But they both have to meet the same. I mean, they're both competing on the same market. Okay, so I think one thing, if anyone's interested in policy, for example, is how do you incentivize people on the demand side to pay more for a product that has lower carbon emissions? I don't think we've got policies for incentivizing people, the producers, to make with lower carbon, but how do you incentivize the end user to do that?
The Europeans are trying.
Yeah, people talk about like a carbon tax, so you tax the end user. I mean, that's an idea. But yeah, no, the grid, so 45V is trying to level playing field a little bit in terms of cost, but still, like the 45V tax credits for green hydrogen don't make the green hydrogen producers' lives all that much easier, because they have things like additionality and then making sure your electrons are actually coming from renewable sources. So it's all complicated for everyone.
Is there any blue hydrogen production today?
In the world?
Yeah, I guess, world, US, do we even know?
I don't.
Yeah, so.
Yeah.
I would imagine there is,
Are we
but
discussing a premium between 2 things that don't exist?
I think Air Liquide might have some stuff.
Yeah. Put it all the way in the back.
Hi, my name's Danny. I'm gonna start with an obvious thing. It's an election year. And you mentioned that the hubs were chosen based on like the need to have a certain amount of geographic and feedstock diversity. And I guess I was wondering how these hubs' viability, like investor appetite, financing appetite, would change based on the administration at the helm, and if any specific hub was specifically exposed more than another one based on these diversity requirements.
Yeah, you know.
In your opinion, sorry.
You never know what can happen, you know, with an election. I've asked this question about like the tax benefits and Inflation Reduction Act a lot, because for example, if somehow you know, things changed and a year from now, like 45V went away or something, right? I think from what I've heard from people in general, that both sides of the aisle, they feel like that's pretty unlikely because usually when there's a tax benefit, so many people get upset. But I don't know. I mean, politicians can sometimes be unpredictable. So,
and so much of it depends on executive orders versus things that have passed through Congress, right? So if depending on sort of how these mechanisms are put into place, a new administration, one of the first things the new administration is going to come in if they don't like sort of the way that the Inflation Reduction Act looks, things that they can probably chip away at some things. There are probably elements of it that were passed through the executive branch that they can chip away at. It gets really messy. I think there's a lot of concern that if a new administration comes in, the sort of appetite for those carrots is going to be smaller, just because when you're talking about fiscal hawks, when you're talking about sort of trying to limit the amount of money that the government actually does spend, then the first things you're going to look at is something, you know, if you're a doubter about the need for that energy conversion or that energy sort of the net zero goals, that's one of the first things you're going to get rid of, right?
Would you think that like the blue hydrogen hubs would be stickier, maybe? Like if it was fossil fuel, like would a Texas hub have more viability than like a Pacific Northwest one? Or
Yeah, that's kind of a dovetail question, right? The sort of, is this a lifeline for fossil fuels? I don't know. I don't. Brian doesn't seem to think that necessarily matters.
I kind of don't think so. I mean, I think it'd be the entire hub, you know, approach to energy innovation would be at risk, and the approach to incentivizing new clean energy technologies and job creation. I don't think it would end up being, okay, this hub in Texas, because you know it's I wouldn't even call it supporting oil and gas, but it's just because that's where you're getting the hydrogen from is less at risk.
Well, and even the rhetoric that you're hearing from big oil companies, I mean, BP rebranded to be BP instead of British Petroleum, right? Because they want to be an energy company. So the rhetoric that you're hearing is, we're just going to produce energy. It's not going to be, obviously they have a lot of investment in clean energy and things like that. But now they're going to sort of, it feels like the momentum is, we're just going to talk about capital E energy, right?
Yeah. But I will say, like, infrastructure bill, Inflation Reduction Act, it is a historic time for energy innovation right now that we'll probably never see in our lifetime. And you know, it's hard to judge history and, you know, realize what's happening, but I think this is probably a really unique time for energy innovation, even without all of the infrastructure, just because there's a convergence of new technologies, a new way of looking at energy systems that I think is pretty unique and global. So, you know, I don't know, 20 years from now, I'm not sure. Hopefully things are just keep get better.
I'm gonna have a follow-up, because one online is sort of about what you've been talking about, and then we're gonna go middle here in the room. So I'm just gonna read it here. Your thoughts on roles, talking about the roles of different companies. It's clear that big companies are participating and their balance sheet can handle big tax credits. What do you see as the role of mid to small players, say down to the home? This maybe gets to Andy's boondoggle question. Is it just that it's big infrastructure and you need big players to do this? And that's why it's, you know, it's all big companies involved, and that's the way it's probably gotta be, or
Yeah, so in the hub program, there was a minimum amount of hydrogen you had to produce, which was fairly substantial, fairly significant. So it'd be really hard for, impossible for like a startup with kind of an unproven technology to hit those metrics. So you've got to be able to, and I think DOE and the hub program is right for doing this. It's like they're incentivizing clean energy at cost and at scale. And so it's hard for, smaller companies to do that. But these projects require contractors, they require a number of different companies in partnership. So I think that's a big role for small and medium enterprises.
Well, and especially if you're vertically integrated, right? If you're a big energy company, you can have maybe your hydrogen program as a loss leader, right? And so it exists maybe to take advantage of 45Q, 45V to then offset some of the stuff that you're doing. I mean, it gets really complicated really fast, but sort of the idea of a giant energy company not thinking about how this is going to deal with how we think about our net zero goals. And then we can, and it happens all the time and it's okay. Somebody like me in the media, it's like, big energy companies want to talk about all the cool stuff they're doing in the renewable space all the time. That doesn't mean they're not still doing space in the fossil fuel, still doing business in the fossil fuel space. And so sort of the idea of, hey, look at this stuff that we're doing in hydrogen, it absolutely makes sense if you're a really big vertically integrated company.
sometimes they say they're engineering companies, but they're actually at time, they stay here, I don't know. Long, but
Okay.
yeah, in the middle of that.
Yeah, I have a tiny and a kind of medium-sized question. The tiny one is, you mentioned no hydrogen for transportation applications. Is that reflective of the DOE's vision for hydrogen?
No, there is hydrogen for transportation.
In the projects that you mentioned, it seemed like they were all kind of industry oriented.
No, like the one ExxonMobil has a transportation, it's all focused on transportation, fueling stations. And I think one of the other ones was as well. So no, transportation is still very much in the mix. Texas or this region also recently just got another DOE grant to create a hydrogen fueling corridor or something like that. Hydrogen, is used for like forklifts and things like that as well, so heavy machinery, so cars, that's where people started debating, is it gonna be good for cars, or do you just use electric vehicles, but for trucking, things like that. Shipping for sure. Yeah.
Well, yeah, the other question was, as you mentioned, on the scale of capital for commercial demonstrations, $8 billion is going to be spread pretty thin. What's the long-term vision? Like, is it supposed to be seeding projects, making them profitable? Because CapEx has kind of been a non-starter for a lot of clean energy innovation in the past.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering what the
I think there are a couple of rules. One is you're helping incentivize a market, so creating a market, so kind of more demand for the clean hydrogen, so then people have more stability, they know what they're selling into. That's one of the main incentives for the infrastructure bill.
Because you're essentially de-risking, right? That's.
Yeah, it's de-risking. I mean, the tax subsidies are essentially de-risking. Yeah, the other thing is you're incentivizing new job creation, so jobs in a new sector, because that is another concern people talk about is, okay, now you create these facilities, do people have the skills, to work there? So the infrastructure bill, these hubs are there to help incentivize and catalyze the job creation as well. So I think it's kind of those two things, but it's definitely to help incentivize market creation as well as production. I mean, Carrie's point about how many blue hydrogen projects are really out there, so they're coming online. But I think those will be the long-term positives from the hub funding. Maybe one last one? Yeah.
Well, thank you. Thinking about that hub, the hydrogen hub, there's a lot of industrial processes that are already well developed and can be applied to help grow the hub. There are going to be a lot of new processes and innovations, and I'm wondering, is there someone in your group that's thinking about environmental aspects or the perspective of, is there potential impact? How do we measure that?
Yeah,
Just is there a perspective from environmental potential?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, and so the hub has to report back to DOE that it's meeting this clean hydrogen standards so that the emissions are below a certain level. And that's all the way from, like, that's across the entire supply chain or whatever, you know, so if you're talking about blue hydrogen, you have to go back and take into account how much fugitive methane emissions are related to natural gas. When you burn hydrogen, different things can happen, like you might make more NOx or something like that. If you're looking at diesel particulate, you're reducing like PM 2.5, like diesel particulate. That's something that people are thinking about. It's all gonna be tracked. I think one of the things that is coming up, people are starting to talk about, once you're moving a lot of hydrogen around, is hydrogen emissions. Like actually hydrogen being lost from like.
How do you detect it, right?
Yeah, so how do you detect it? Is it gonna be a problem? So, I mean, people are trying to get ahead of the curve now and talking about that. EDF has supported some good preliminary studies on thinking about that. But all those things will be important. If you are burning ammonia to propel a ship across the Atlantic, you know, there are catalysts and things to scrub NOx out of that, but is it gonna be effective enough to not have a bunch of NOx now? All of those things need to be considered.
Yeah, I think
They
that
will be.
the sort of momentum to transparency in all of, I mean, even the University of Texas having a methane emissions specific,
Yeah.
program to study, the first thing you have to do is catalog exactly what's happening, right? And so I think the advancements in figuring out what we're doing when we're building these things and when things are happening, I think that technology is actually getting better. And so we're going to have the ability to be more transparent about exactly what's happening. We're not necessarily, and we're relying on satellites, and we're relying on all sorts of different things to make that. For somebody like me in my space, I'm trying to figure out, exactly what's going on, so as transparent as possible about everything. And I think there is certainly a push, not only from those in the media, but also industry wants to know. They want to know what where things are being wasted. And so there's a huge push and actually money being put into that, which is good.
But you mentioned trust
Yeah.
earlier, and trust is undivided these days.
Yeah.
Right? And so good solid data can help build trust. We think, right, from the engineering and the scientific.
Yeah, and that's an important role of the university, is to try to get out there, measure things so that you know whether there's a problem or not a problem, and come up with solutions.
And the collaboration between industry and universities has become, it seems like, even greater. Now there's sort of that, there was a lot of distrust, I feel like, or at least there wasn't a whole lot of sharing of data. And now, way more so than I remember, industry is sort of like, we can use the expertise of the academies to make it better. I don't know. I mean, I'm sure there are ways to go, but.
Yeah, well, UT's, we're kind of a special place. We've got a lot of expertise in fundamental research and everything, but we do have a lot of collaborations with companies that are putting money into research. They care about our students. We've got we're the talent pipeline for them. So we do have strong connections with industry partners, but trying to get data, just getting data sometimes, like on things related to the power grid, it's not all that trivial. I mean, and the data is worth something to these companies. It's not always, oh, we don't wanna share with you our emissions. It's like, well, this data actually is worth a lot and we're not gonna give it away for free. I think there's actually that people being worried about scholarship in the closet. I don't know, you
Yeah,
probably deal with
UT's,
this a lot.
yeah, I'll try to get data, of course, yeah. And UT's role, one of the main roles as life cycle assessment, kind of arbiter of the project, and then you'll get into all these energy emission attribute credits and all these kind of things that are being discussed now. So that gives UT a chance to be at the center of how you take data and turn it into metrics.
Right,
And
yeah.
should get access to that, so.
Yeah.
So that's, I think, an exciting part, and everyone in there, yeah, so Director of the Energy Institute, Professor Kevin. Thank you.